Yeah, good morning once again and welcome to my presentation as part of the panel discussion on procurement and effective financial management practices during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will start with the pandemic and say a few things about it. Now, with the coronavirus pandemic causing fiscal devastation around the world, we can expect fraud, bribery, theft, and other criminal practices will rise as people seek to exploit this emergency for their own gains. Now, lives will undoubtedly be lost as a result of vital funds and supplies being siphoned away. And that will sit us, because of the pandemic, we have to look at healthcare. So the corruption in healthcare. Now, corruption is already rife in healthcare systems around the world, before pandemic anyway, because the Transparency International says that it costs health sector $500 billion every year in corruption. Now, this staggering figure is based on normal times. That means before COVID. Right now, in an extraordinary times of the pandemic, the risk of corruption is even more acute. Government under extreme pressure to provide equipment and medicines. Now, these factors have created an environment which is ripe for embezzlement, false claims, kickbacks, and other forms of corruption that can undermine efforts to defeat this deadly virus. Now, for example, Amazon, as we know, we all trade on Amazon, has shut down 3,900 accounts online because the retail giants said we're charging too much for the health products. Now, Amazon said people had been violating its fair pricing policy by practicing price gouging. Now, price gouging is where you inflate prices during emergency situations like maybe natural disaster, flood, or earthquake, or hurricane, or, then you try to inflate prices, and that is against the law. We call it the price gouging. So Amazon had to remove about 500,000 items because of the price gouging connected to COVID pandemic. Now, there's the complexity of public procurement is also there for us to see. Because you see, public procurement is one of the government activities most vulnerable to corruption. If you look at all government activities, procurement is the one that is most prone to corruption. We all know the kickbacks and 10% and 20% and all that. In addition to the volume of transactions, the financial interests at stake, corruption risk are exacerbated by the complexity of the procurement processes, as well as close interaction between the public officials and businesses and the multitude of stakeholders. All these give rooms for corruption to rise in procurement processes. Public institutions as well as state-owned enterprise need to procure goods, services, and work to carry out their responsibilities and duties normally. But we also know that 10 to 30% of the investment in publicly funded construction projects is lost through mismanagement and corruption. 20 to 30% of project value lost through corruptions are widespread across the world, particularly in developing countries. Total volume of procurement, which is the government activity of purchasing goods, services, and works, accounted for 12% of the GDP. So in terms of cost of corruption, the construction sector transparency initiative called COST estimate that annual losses in global construction through mismanagement, inefficiency, and corruption could reach a whopping $2.5 trillion by this end of this year. So, corrupt act in the public procurement. Now, various types of corrupt act used to exploit these vulnerabilities include embezzlement, undue influence in the needs assessment, bribery of public officials involved in the award process, or fraud in bid evaluations, invoices, or contract obligations. In many countries, significant corruption risk arise from conflict of interest in decision-making, which may distort the allocation of resources through public procurement. Bid rigging and cartelism may further undermine the procurement process. Almost 2/3 of foreign bribery cases studied occurred in sectors closely associated with contracts or licensing through public procurement. So the direct cost of corruption through procurement include loss of public funds through misallocation or higher expenses and lower quality of goods, services, and works. Now, those paying the bribe seeks to recover, obviously, their money by inflating prices, billing for work not performed, failing to meet contract standards, reducing quality of work, or using inferior materials, resulting in exaggerated cost and a decrease in quality. So what are some of the strategies to overcome these challenges? One of them, as yesterday we talked about, is the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, a foundation, which is a foundation for involvement of every stakeholder in the society in the fight against corruption or against this graft. Because the basic assumption is that the fight against corruption cannot be left entirely in the hands of a standalone institution such as an anti-corruption agency. And that's why we need a national anti-corruption strategy that will allow everybody to be part of the fight against corruption. We also need to strengthen and harmonize the judicial framework. And in this case, we look again at a robust Anti-Corruption Act, independent of investigation and prosecution of cases. So that act will give power to prosecute, powers to compel a person or an institution to produce document or appear before the commission, restricting the disposals of properties of persons under investigation with an order of court. Restrictions on income from such properties may be imposed, reversing the burden of proof in the corruption court cases. The proposition will place the burden of proof on the person pursued for corruption to prove his innocence and not the anti-corruption institution, contrary to the current prevailing principle in corruption cases. And this particular clause in some anti-corruption act I've seen around the world is the most powerful clause. However, in most countries, even the parliament will not look at this to change the burden of proof. So that what that you do, Anti-Corruption Commission, if they realize that you have some lifestyle, you have acquired some properties as a public servant, and they realize that your income cannot enable you to acquire those properties, all that they do is that they take you to court and ask you to tell the judge how you acquire all these properties. So the burden of proof is on you, the accused. And if you can't, then the state will take over the properties. In fact, most countries like Hong Kong and other countries that are dealing with corruption very well, these are the two they use. This very clause, very powerful clause. But I'm most afraid most countries will not allow this clause to be in their statutory books. Another one is the declaration of assets and liabilities by public servants. Again, yesterday we talked about this. The UNCAC requires state parties. That means every country that have signed to that treaty or that convention to consider establishing policies requiring officials to review to appropriate authorities. In this case, it will be anti-corruption agency like Integrity Commission, their outside activity, employment, investment, assets, and substantial gift or benefits. Declaration of assets and liability by public servant to be made compulsory as a major step in ensuring probity and accountability. And I know that that is what you do mostly in the Caribbean region. A disclosure allows public employees' wealth to be monitored. So that is for assets declaration. Now, the public sector reform to promote anti-corruption agenda is also another way to look at it. And again, paying bureaucrats or public servants higher salaries. There is an argument on that, whether if you pay higher salaries, whether it can deal with corruption or not. But Singapore have done that. Singapore pay higher salaries for their bureaucrats or public sector workers than even the private sector. But there's a whole argument around that. Privatization or privatizing corrupt government service can also reduce corruption. Then decentralization can reduce corruption by bringing the accountability for program implementation to elected officials who are elected exclusively by the population they serve and who risk losing their elected position if the program is highly corrupt. We have public sector reforms to promote anti-corruption agenda in the case of transparency and good governance in the public sector. Effective public procurement implementation, openness to public budgeting and accountability, and obviously the effective financial management and tracking system. Regular and effective audit services, doing auditing on spot, unannounced or regular. And of course, effective tax regime can all help to deal with this issue. So in conclusion, I would say that the COVID-19 pandemic will test public financial management system in many ways. Now, key challenges are likely to come from reassessing fiscal policy needs and identifying additional financial resources. 2, ensuring timely availability of funds to service delivery units. And 3, tracking, accounting for, and reporting in a transparent manner the resources deployed for emergency responses, and ensuring business continuity when faced with absence of staff. Supreme Audit Institution, which is the Auditor General, could play a key role in assessing whether public funds were appropriated for the right use, or they do export impact of measures. That means that exports being after implementation. They assess the impact and see whether what the money was allocated for has been used appropriately. And finally, in all that, they need to establish accountability. Thank you for the opportunity to present my bit. Thank you very much.
It is indeed a pleasure to join this very important discussion on effective financial management and procurement during the pandemic. What I will share is really the Jamaica's experience in terms of how we are coping with monitoring government spending or public procurement during this difficult time that we now face. I will start by just introducing the Integrity Commission as Jamaica's foremost anti-corruption entity. I will then go into contextualizing the situation in terms of the COVID effects on this country and what we are doing in terms of trying to monitor and where necessary investigate public spending in Jamaica. And then of course I will look at some lessons that we have learned from the process and share those with you. At the end of that, as the moderator has indicated, I will take questions towards the end after the third presenter. So I will then start with the Integrity Commission. So the Integrity Commission was established in 2017 by way of an amalgamation of 3 entities. We call them legacy entities, being the Office of the Contractor General, the Parliamentary Integrity Commission, and the Commission for the Prevention of Corruption. And of course, this was by an act of Parliament, the Integrity Commission Act. Of course, many of you may be aware of the travails that ensued before the passing of this legislation, because corruption, of course, is a big issue here in Jamaica and the Caribbean in general. And so civil society and several interests across the country have been clamoring for some time for a piece of legislation or a construct which properly deals with the issue of corruption. What I can say is that the Act has gone a far way in terms of addressing some of the issues relating to corruption. It is not a perfect piece of legislation, but if applied and implemented properly, we can, of course, reap several successes just from this one piece of legislation and the other accompanying pieces of legislation which exists within the jurisdiction. I will share with you the principal objects of the Act. And of course, you can see there in Section 3 of the Act, the objects of the Act are outlined. The first one is to further encourage and promote propriety and integrity among persons exercising public functions in Jamaica. 3B, promote and strengthen measures for prevention, detection, investigation, and prosecution of acts of corruption. But the one with which I believe we are most concerned is, in this presentation, is really to ensure that government contracts are awarded, varied, renewed, or terminated impartially, on merit, and in a financially prudent manner. The fourth object is really to enhance public confidence that acts of corruption and impropriety committed by persons exercising public functions will be appropriately investigated and dealt with in a manner which achieves transparency, accountability, and fairness. So those are the guiding principles for this piece of legislation. How then does the Integrity Commission, having been established by virtue of the passing of this piece of legislation, how does it go about exercising its mandate and achieving the purpose for which it was established? The Commission currently has 3 operating divisions. The first division, and the first presenter alluded to the declaration of assets by public officers. The first division, which is the Information and Complaints Division, is the division which deals with this kind of activity, wherein over 30 to 40,000 public officials are required annually to declare their assets and liabilities to the Commission. And of course, it is a criminal offense not to do so, or to mislead the Commission in making any declaration to it. The second operation division, which I head, is the Investigation Division. And this division is responsible for the monitoring of government contracts, licensing, and of course, investigate where necessary any act of corruption or impropriety which come about as a result of the process. And of course, the third operating division is the Corruption Prosecution Division, and this is a unique component of the Commission. Not many integrity commissions in the jurisdiction, or that we know of, have this a prosecutor in-house which deals predominantly with the prosecution of corruption offenses. So this is a power that has been granted to the Integrity Commission for the exercise of its mandate. Of course, a part of the travails has been over time the somewhat low levels of prosecution of corruption offenses within this jurisdiction, and where they are prosecuted in many cases, there is the result that would be expected reasonably is not achieved. And of course, this may be a function of this how specialized corruption related offenses are, and the requirement that there is special skills which certain prosecutors must exercise in order to successfully prosecute these matters. So that is a function now under the Integrity Commission, which of course we are setting up and which we will be exercising in short order when the need arises, or if it does in any case. The general functions of the Commission are outlined in Section 6 of the Act, and it's really, and I will just highlight the areas which deal predominantly with monitoring and investigating offenses, corruption offenses, as well as improprieties in the allegations of impropriety within the grant of. And of course, the Commission can investigate alleged or suspected acts of corruption and instances of non-compliance, monitor and, where necessary, investigate the award, implementation, and termination of contracts. And this function is particularly assigned to the Director of Investigation, who is entitled to be advised of all government contracts, the issuance of any licenses or variation, termination, anything having to do with contracts generally, and the grant of licenses. So each public body, and we have about 197 public bodies in Jamaica, all of them from time to time will engage in contracts. They have to report those contracts to the Commission, and in a little while I will outline to you how they are, what method is employed in having them meet this requirement. We also look at things such as the registration of contractors. So a big part of the process is really looking at the contractors, because a lot of the times that's where the corruption comes about. It's really the persons who are the actors in the process, whether there is a conflict of interest or whether due process has been observed, and so on. So these are some of the things that we look on. We have a huge database of information regarding contractors, which we from time to time interrogate when we are conducting our investigations or even monitoring exercises. So that encapsulates really the legislative instrument of the Commission, the Integrity Commission Act. I would then look at what we're doing in terms of the monitoring of the COVID-19 pandemic and government spending within this setup. So in March 2020, about March 10th, we got our first COVID-19 case in Jamaica. And of course, you can imagine, as all of you are in some way affected by this pandemic, the chain of events which ensued following the confirmation of a case, a positive case of COVID-19 within the jurisdiction. So there was a lot of government spending, a lot of activities which were unplanned took place, and so we are left as an oversight body to make sense of it and to ensure that everything is above board and that the necessary persons are held to the high standard of accountability which is required in these kinds of situations. As at October 6th, 2020, the government of Jamaica reported that it had allocated $43.8 billion, and this is towards the the COVID-19 pandemic. This is about 2 to 3% of the country's GDP. So you would understand that there is a huge amount of expenditure in that area. And so we thought that it was necessary to look at And you will see why in a while, to look at how this money is being spent and what the processes are that are being observed and whether they conform to the procurement rules, law, and regulations. From what we're able to discern at this time, over 3,000 contracts were awarded just in the few short months in relation to fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. This is, of course, a significant number of contracts, particularly when you look at this within the context of a small commission with only about 8 inspectors who monitor these contracts. And so you would understand that we will have to put in place certain measures to ensure that we are being effective, because there is no way at all that we could effectively monitor 3,000 contracts at any one time with such small numbers in terms of staff. So we have implemented a process by which we would go about monitoring, or where necessary, investigate these procurement activities. From what we have seen so far, the preferred method of procurement during the pandemic is really the direct contracting or sole source methodology. What this says is really that there is no competition in the process. And of course, this is where you often, from our experience, find problems where you are the procuring entity is able to go directly to a contractor of their choice. And so this can cause several issues. Of course, emergency contracting is also the second preferred method of procurement. So we'll look at these a little bit closer later on in the presentation and perhaps in the discussions later, but just to highlight for you that, as we had expected with a situation such as this COVID-19 pandemic, the go-to methodologies that would be employed in procurement would be, of course, direct contracting and emergency contracting methodologies. Of course, in all of this, it is incumbent on every government to ensure that it has certain measures in place to ensure that there is effective financial management. And we can see some of this material coming out from the World Bank, where it really outlines or highlights for governments, for countries, that you really need to have a system in place where you minimize fraud and corruption, even in a situation as dire as this, the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in Jamaica, the situation is no different. We are ensuring that we take the necessary steps to ensure that we monitor and, where possible or where necessary, investigate to ensure that that corruption and fraud are either not in play or they are kept at a minimum. How can the objectives be attained of effective financial management practices? This is what we think. So it's important that governments generally have in place a procurement plan. And you may ask, how is it that they are going to have a procurement plan in place where you do not necessarily know what is going to happen one day to the other? But what is necessary is some sort of joined up approach in terms of how government goes about procuring especially supplies for this emergency situation. And so I think what is necessary, of course, and what we have seen in the region, are several committees being established to monitor. And so where you have a multi-sectorial team on board, what you can do is really to come up with a comprehensive plan which really takes care of the broad needs of all the different players within the process. So that is necessary, a joined up approach, and of course a broad procurement plan, and that will help in terms of being able to say what items will be procured, or to give an estimate of what the procurement forecast will look like over the next couple of months. I have said to you earlier that, of course, the dominant procurement methodologies are the direct contracting and emergency, and you can see on screen there the chart. 56% of the contracts awarded during the period were either direct or sole source procurement. Of course, emergency contracting or direct contracting is not unlawful, but there are guidelines within the Public Procurement Act in Jamaica and the regulations which outline how entities are to go about utilizing these methodologies. So what really we are looking at is not necessarily to prevent entities from utilizing the emergency or the direct contracting methodologies, but to ensure that they stick to code in terms of how they go about using these methodologies to procure items. We need to, of course, ensure that there is proper record keeping, because that is the only way you can go back in time to see whether or not they conformed to the rules. So record keeping is an important element, and of course there are laws within our jurisdiction or within Jamaica which require that public entities keep records for a certain number of years. And of course we do not foresee that the pandemic will last necessarily for another 8 to 9 years in the form that it is now. So we expect that these records, if kept, will be available for some time to come. Of course, we have asked for all procurement activities to be reported as regards the COVID-19 pandemic. And how we have done this, we have always asked for government entities to report all their contracting activities through what we call the QCA, the Quarterly Contract Awards. So every quarter, each entity has to submit a report of all the procurement activities which they have conducted, of course, for a value of $500,000 or above. So what we have done now is really to ask that they include in that report all the procurement activities which relate to COVID-19 as special items. So they will highlight for us all the procurement activities which are related to the COVID-19 pandemic, in addition to the other procurement activities which they are currently undertaking. We're out of time now, but what I will highlight for you just now is really what we think that public bodies can do in ensuring that there is proper oversight in the public procurement process, even during the COVID-19 pandemic. The first thing that I would suggest is that there needs to be a building of capacity within these entities. The officers who are responsible for monitoring contracts or for investigating irregularities in the award of contract or the grant of licenses need to be properly trained and supported in that role, because often, well, it is quite certain that you are not going to be able to detect any irregularities if you are not yourself, as the person conducting oversight, if you are not yourself knowledgeable of all the rules, regulations, and processes that are supposed to obtain. So we have to build capacity in this regard. Of course, and that has to do necessarily with the monitoring component, but there are times when you will, of course, switch or upgrade your activities from monitoring to investigation. And so you have to ensure that your investigators are properly trained and skilled, particularly in the areas of investigative interviewing, case analysis, investigation, decision making, and report writing. Because at the end of the day, they can collect all this information, but they must use this information in a way that adds value, or which paints the right picture or an accurate picture of the goings on in terms of the procurement activities. So that's one suggestion. The other thing is robust monitoring. We have to ensure that insofar as the legislation permits, and in the case of the Integrity Commission, there is a requirement on the part of public bodies to report their procurement activities to the Commission. So you have to ensure that you enforce the reporting requirements or responsibility on the part of the public bodies. Ensure that they submit their reports of all the procurement activities from one quarter to the next, or if you do it on a monthly basis, ensure that this is accurate, where where they are submitted, you have to ensure that you interrogate to ensure that you have full disclosure, because that is the only way that you can necessarily make sense of the information that is placed before you. It is also important to develop and utilize monitoring and audit techniques. For example, spot monitoring, and that was alluded to by the first presenter. Of course, it's important to do site visits there, especially for contracts that the results are not necessarily visible from the outside. You have to actually go to the facilities to check for yourself to ensure that the work that was supposed to be done under the contract was actually done. So that's very important. And in the last couple of months, we have really ramped up our site visit activities. Of course, taking the necessary precautions that are required under this COVID-19 pandemic situation. Another thing is I said earlier that there is no way that you can effectively monitor 3,000 contracts, each and every one of them. So you have to take a methodology, implement a methodology, which will facilitate effective monitoring without causing staff to become burnt out. Because if you take on too much, what you will find is that you will not do a good job of monitoring these activities. So we take a risk-based approach, and some of the things that we do, the first question, of course, when we are looking at the methodologies employed, for example, emergency contracting methodology or the sole source, is to ask the first question, which is this a true emergency? And if it is not a true emergency, then of course you need an explanation as to why a particular procurement methodology was utilized. The second thing that you have to do, and this is really a comprehensive approach, it's multifaceted. So you have to look at, of course, contractor profiling. Look for conflict of interest situations, and some of the data you can really interrogate is really data from, for example, the company's office in your local jurisdiction, to see who the directors of these contracting entities are. Whether persons who are involved in the decision-making process, in the procurement process, for example, if these persons are also shareholders in these companies that are receiving contracts. But of course, the investigators have to know exactly where to look to find this information. Ensure that contractors are qualified, ensure that they have a good track record in the area for which they are being contracted. You'll find that there is a risk, especially now, that you'll have some contractors who are born overnight. So as soon as the pandemic comes about, some of them, they go and they register companies. Some of these persons are persons who are themselves involved in the procurement process. So you have to ensure that these contractors have some amount of track record, because I would imagine if you're going to use a methodology such as direct contracting, that you would ensure that the contractors who you are employing are persons who have a track record in that area. Of course, you have to look at the frequency and the cumulative value of the contracts awarded to any particular contractor. It may be that you are realizing just by checking the data that contractor A has received a significant number of contracts, accounting for a significant value in terms of the monetary award of these cumulative contracts. So that is also an area to look in. It is not necessarily that because a particular contractor gets a certain amount of contract that person is in some way conflicted, but it is one of the things that you have to look at when you go about monitoring these contracts or investigating for that matter. Of course, I said earlier that you have to scrutinize the directorship of these companies. So the point is made here again, that you have to look to see that procurement officers are not also directors of the companies for which these contracts are being awarded to. Of course, you have to look at the incorporation dates of companies, and you have to juxtapose that with the dates of the date of the pandemic, its first arrival in the jurisdiction, because you will find, as I said before, that some of these companies are dated in terms of their establishment close to the start of the pandemic, and some of them may not be experts in the field. and it's just a way of ciphering off public funds. So that is also an important consideration to make in monitoring and investigating contracts and the procurement process. And that is, I will share this final slide with you in terms of officers who are involved in the process of contract monitoring or investigation. It is important that you make recommendations and follow up to see what the results are in terms of the actions taken by these public bodies. It is commonplace here at the Integrity Commission for our officers to make recommendations to the procuring entities, and these recommendations, we must say, are usually followed, and they respond to us to say this is what we have done in respect of the recommendations that you have made to us. Of course, there is also guidance that the Integrity Commission can provide to procurement officers. Procurement, in the form that it is now, is a fairly recent activity, so it will take some time for the level of knowledge that is required in a mature way to really establish itself in the jurisdiction. So we have to ensure that we rely on our Integrity Commission officers who are expert themselves, many of them in procurement, to give guidance to these officers in the procuring entity. Engage your stakeholders where necessary, where possible. For example, in ways such as this, virtual training sessions, discussions, awareness sessions, things to look out for as procuring entities, so as to stay away from activities that may not necessarily be cast in the best light as far as procurement is concerned. And of course, track your progress as an entity over time. It makes no sense to be doing this job and you're not sure of the effect that you're having on the procurement landscape and how governments go about managing public funds, as it is a very important activities. And the first presenter alluded to some of the ills that are concerned with poor public financial management. So we have to ensure that we track our progress as Integrity Commissions to ensure that we are making an impact, and where necessary, make change. That is it for my presentation. Thank you very much for allowing me.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. It is quite an honor for me to be here in this very, very important session as we speak about activities in procurement and integrity. I must say I've learned quite a lot from the first two speakers. They have enlightened me a lot on procurement and they gave me some good ideas as to how we can improve on our current procurement regime here in Grenada. Just to put things in context a bit, Grenada, relative to Jamaica, is quite a small economy, all right? There's not a large manufacturing sector. Suppliers are few, I may say, and it is still quite evolving. The procurement regime is still quite evolving. We had only passed the act in 2014, and it really started to implementation really started in 2016. So we are relatively new with procurement, and we are still trying to change the behaviors and mindset that have been embedded in our system for many, many, many years. So it is a challenge, but we are making small progress as we go along. Well, when the COVID come, and this is what my presentation will be quite short, but just a brief, just to share our experience briefly with the onset of the COVID-19 virus earlier on this year, how we managed through it and some of the lessons learned, right? So around March of this year, the COVID-19 came. It was in our region, not necessarily hit Grenada directly as yet, but it was in our region, and we had to take all the necessary precautions. There were some immediate requirements, including medical supplies, masks, pharmaceuticals, toiletries, hand sanitizers, liquid soap. Construction buildings had to be outfitted to make special accommodation in case that the virus hit us heavily, right? So from a procurement perspective, how do we acquire those things? Well, our act gives us a provision that we can use under special circumstances. It is in section 35 of our act. It is called negotiated procurement or direct procurement. Same principle as what was related by the Jamaican speaker. It deals with owing to a sudden unforeseen event and there is an urgent need for the goods. So that is where, when we invoke that provision under our act, the conditions that the COVID virus brought has satisfied. We were able to go directly to suppliers to obtain those urgently needed items. Yes, of course, we were not prepared for that. There were hardly any knowledge or any foreseeable knowledge that such a situation would arrive on us in such a short space of time. So we were, from a procurement point of view, we were not prepared for that, but to give us that windows, works, and services too, while we comply with our regulations. So yeah, so we use section 35. There was, although this section is called negotiated procurement, it is really direct procurement, right? Once the circumstance is laid out that it is sudden and unforeseen, and there is urgent need for the goods, we go directly to the suppliers. From many others in our region, it says negotiated because even if there is an emergency situation, the act still implies that you should negotiate on prices. In other words, do not let any supplier, because of the situation, do not let a supplier take advantage of disasters and emergency situations. Suppliers may want to abuse the situation and call for higher prices. Therefore, the act says, well, if the opportunity is there, you can negotiate your prices still and not just accept what is being offered by the supplier. However, I doubt that is being done. A negotiation can take time, so we just went directly to the supplier and we purchase. Yeah, so, and it was not, I understand that from the Jamaican experience, it was over 3,000 contracts. That is way more than what Grenada had. I'm sure we had just less than 100 of contracts that were awarded during the COVID period, the few months or so during the lockdown period, where it could have been considered as an emergency. So it is quite a small amount, but we endeavor to comply with the regulations. And the lessons we learned, what we realized is that had we had something called a framework agreement in place, it would have made our job a lot easier, right? With a framework agreement, you can have its record. So had we had an arrangement with suppliers that we have already agreed on the terms and conditions as to how you would supply, and also the prices. So the price about there is no time, there is no negotiation for price. So that is something that we realize it would be good to have in place, because as we know, there would be, we are still vulnerable to lots of various types of emergency situations, be it pandemic like COVID-19 or even hurricane or floods and other natural disasters. So with a framework agreement in place, you can avoid the opportunity for corruption. You can have better administrative and financial governance, right? There, of course, there is better outcome for transparency because your process is a transparent one. It is done on a competitive basis prior to the onset of the emergency situation. You also have the security of supply through the binding of supplier to supply future purchase that is ensured. You achieve cost savings through large purchases due to the economies of scale. So there are many benefits if you were to institute a framework agreement, and that is something we are working on at the moment. It is something quite new to us. It is something that we're still learning about, but with assistance from other experienced agencies, we are beginning to consider having framework agreements. We also have centralized purchasing. This would help to ensure that you have a guaranteed amount of supplies based on agreement with the supplier as time goes by, not necessarily in an emergency situation, but in an effort to save costs and have a more secure supply of goods to the various ministries and departments. We are looking into centralized procurement of what we call the common use items. These are the items that are being used throughout the public service, rather than each ministry or each department going about its own purchase. We thought it would be better if we consolidate and centralize the purchasing so that we agree with the supplier to supply and deliver on a timely basis to the various entities. And with that, we can certainly save on costs, especially administrative costs and other areas, and our financial system would be freed up of the large amounts of checks and invoices that we have to process for each particular ministry or department. Other lessons learned, yes, it is important to have a proper financial and administrative system running and being effective, especially during a time like the COVID time, because procurement is only part of the process. You have to have systems in place for the payment of your suppliers. And during the COVID period, I must say that procurement and our accounting division always kept running. There were at no time at all did we stop the accounting division in the Ministry of Finance. So the process was quite smoothly. Suppliers were still, even during the lockdown time, suppliers were still able to be paid and to receive monies, and transactions were being dealt with as during that time. So it is important to have your financial and administrative setup organized to deal with situations like COVID. Planning is also very, very important. planning for emergency situations, having a preparedness and response plan would help quite a lot. If we had that, we would know what steps to take and how the process should flow in an emergency situation. So the COVID experience has really opened up our eyes to a lot of the things we can now put in place as we prepare for similar circumstances in the future, right? We also have to be prepared to be flexible with our administrative rules from home, working on a shift system, and being more flexible with officers that may not be exactly in line with current processes and current rules and regulations. But in times like these emergency situations, we have to be quite flexible. Another important one, it is important for procurement to be close to Integrity Commission. I recognize that in Jamaica, the Integrity Commission is closely linked and work along very closely with the procurement division, and that is something we here can even look at. We can look at also. Procurement alone would not solve all our issues with corruption or irregularities in our acquisition of goods works. We need to have the combined effort of all the various entities working together to reduce corruption, because as I said in our first presentation, procurement is one of the areas where for many. So looking back at the experience from COVID, it is important that we have systems in place, our financial systems, our administrative systems, and our various agencies of anti-corruption and other financial irregularities that deals with financial irregularities like the FIU and all those. I know we have a Integrity in Public Life Bill and similar pieces of legislation should all be working together so that overall we can reduce the chances of corruption, chances of bad practices, chances of irregularities in our procurement system. And that is really what I wanted to share with our folks. It was quite a very rewarding experience for me to be on this program, listening from the experience of Jamaica especially, and how they have developed their procurement system. I've been following the procurement system for many years now, and it is quite heartening to know that they have reached quite a long way. We are there behind, but we are trying to make good efforts to improve. We are considering looking at our Procurement Act and making amendments to both the act and the regulations to better suit and better fit our local economy and our current environment in which we procure goods, works, and services. So that's all I can say now. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share the Grenadian experience with you relating to COVID-19.